Hello everybody, and welcome to this fourth video of Merfolk Joe's Guide to Modern Merfolk. This video will discuss all the creatures in the main deck of Modern Merfolk, and the basic roles they play. We'll look first at the two Island Walk Lords, then, in order, Cursecatcher, Silvergill Adept, Harbinger of the Tides, and Merrow Reejerey, Master of Waves, and finally, the only non-Merfolk in the deck, Kira Great Glass Spinner. My remarks here are not meant to be comprehensive nor definitive. If you would like me to expand on any point or have any questions, please leave a comment. As I mentioned in the second video, Merfolk as a deck archetype exists because of Lord of Atlantis and Master of the Pearl Trident. These 8 cards form the absolute core of the modern Merfolk deck and are the primary incentive for limiting the deck to playing only other Merfolk creatures. As 2 casting cost 2/2 creatures, Lord of Atlantis and Master of the Pearl Trident are reasonable creatures in a vacuum. With an empty hand, these cards are good draws off the top of the deck, as they establish a clock on their own, and make all future Merfolk draws better by giving them +1/+1. But these lords really shine when the opponent controls an island, because they give all our other Merfolk Island Walk, making them unblockable. This can end games immediately, even if the opponent has a large board presence and a high life total. It's important to mention here that Spreading Seas is an essential card for the deck because it enables this powerful tribal synergy, while also drawing us a card and disrupting the opponent's mana. Because their effect is so powerful, it's often best to keep these lords in hand until we've established a board presence with several other creatures. In this way, when we do finally play the lords, they can have an immediate impact by making our attackers bigger and unblockable. Leading with these lords is rarely the correct line of play, but can sometimes be optimal against certain decks such as Tron, which run damage-based sweeper spells like Pyroclasm. By leading with lords on turns 2 and 3, we hope to quickly get all of our creatures outside the range of Pyroclasm's 2 damage. Unlike many of the other creatures in the deck, Lord of Atlantis and Master of the Pearl Trident are relatively straightforward, and are not particularly tricky at all. They make our creatures bigger and give them Island Walk, and that's about it. We should expect all our opponents to be aware of these effects and play accordingly. Next, however, I'll be talking about Cursecatcher, one of our trickiest creatures, whose effect, especially when combined with AEther Vial, can be very difficult for opponents to play around. Cursecatcher is probably the single most debated card in the deck. I've heard many Merfolk pilots unfairly criticize this creature, often calling him the worst card in the deck. Many people have a misguided understanding of what it means for a card to be the worst card in a finely tuned competitive Magic deck. In reality, there's never an objectively worse card, because every card performs a unique function at a specific point on the deck's mana curve. Yes, Cursecatcher can be a terrible top deck in a long, drawn-out game, but every 1-mana creature in Magic is weaker in the late game. However, Cursecatcher is certainly the best card to have on the board when your opponent is stuck at 3 lands and would love to resolve the anger of the gods sitting in his hand. Cursecatcher is the best card for us to have in hand, with an AEther Vial on 1, acting as a surprise counterspell when our lands are all tapped. And Cursecatcher is great against fast combo decks like Ad Nauseam, Goryo's Vengeance, Living End, and, as we saw in the second video, Infect, often slowing these decks down by an entire turn. Hunter Nance, one of Modern Merfolk's most successful pilots, has repeatedly called Cursecatcher the worst card in the deck. Yet, in the semifinals of SCG Charlotte last year, in a must-win situation against Tom Ross playing Infect, Cursecatcher blew Tom out, stealing Game 1 and allowing Hunter to ultimately win the match and move on to the finals. Granted, Hunter got very lucky, but he got lucky by having Cursecatchers in hand. It was an incredible match, and one that every aspiring Modern Merfolk master should watch. The match demonstrated how reductive it is to label Cursecatcher as the quote-unquote worst card in the deck, when there are clearly many situations in which he shines. So with all that being said, let's get down to why exactly Cursecatcher is so incredible, and why he is played over other 1-mana creature options in the deck. In order to fully understand the power of Cursecatcher, we need to look at the entire card. First, he's a Merfolk, so he benefits from tribal synergies, such as getting bigger with lords on the battlefield, triggering Merrow Reejerey, and helping pay Silvergill Adept's additional cost. For this reason, Cursecatcher in this deck is miles ahead of other non-Merfolk options, such as Cloudfin Raptor and Judge's Familiar. Second, his ability is very powerful, especially in the early game, when Merfolk's tempo plan is in highest gear. A turn 1 Cursecatcher on the play is very strong, preventing Thoughtseize or other similar discard spells from resolving on our opponent's first turn, allowing us to keep our best 2-cost spells for our second turn. In such cases, Cursecatcher essentially acts as a spell pierce. This type of versatility is the hallmark of a good tempo creature, being able to act as an attacking threat or a counterspell depending upon varying circumstances packs more functionality into the deck's 60-card main deck. There are 3 other Merfolk competing for Cursecatcher's spot in the deck. They are Kosi's Trickster, Triton Shorestalker, and Moth Dust Changeling. I have extensively tested all 3 options and will briefly explain why they're all inferior to Cursecatcher. It's important to note here that as Merfolk, all these creatures receive Pump and Island Walk effects from Lords, and can be used to reveal for Silvergill Adept or to trigger Merrow Reejerey. So let's start with Kosi's Trickster. Her ability reads, whenever an opponent shuffles his or her library, you may put a +1/+1 counter on Kosi's Trickster. Some Merfolk pilots see this ability and envision an endless string of games where opponents are cracking fetch lands every turn, making Trickster huge. Such a game might look something like this. Our opponent has played a fetch land on their first turn and then passed it to us. We play an island and cast Kosi's Trickster. Now, the opponent might not recognize this card. They might assume that it's a Cursecatcher, so they let it resolve. And at the end of our turn, they crack their fetch land in order to get a tapped shock land into play. At that point, we tell the opponent that our Kosi's Trickster gets a +1/+1 counter and is now a 2/2. And this is the point at which the opponent will probably actually just read our card. On their turn, they'll untap, and in this dream scenario, they'll play another fetch land, and because they want to play their 2-drop, they have to crack the fetch land, of course making the Trickster into a 3/3. The opponent taps their lands, play their 2-drop, and passes back to us. We'll play our second land on our turn 2, reveal a second Trickster to make sure that Wanderwine Hub enters the battlefield untapped. We can go ahead and tap our island to play the second Kosi's Trickster, and then with that one on board, create white mana with the Wanderwine Hub in order to cast Path to Exile to get rid of the opponent's Dark Confidant. Merfolk pilots who play Kosi's Trickster always splash white in order to run Path to Exile because it increases the opponent's shuffle effects. So here, with the Dark Confidant getting exiled, the opponent fetches a forest out of their deck, shuffles yet again, and at this point in this scenario, our 2/2 drops are a 4/4 and a 2/2, and we haven't even played any Merfolk Lords yet. Certainly looks very strong. However, imagine a rather commonplace example of the opponent simply drawing shocklands in basics, leaving Kosi's Trickster as a 1/1. Even if the opponent does draw into fetch lands, he can decide not to crack them if making Kosi's Trickster bigger would be a problem, especially if he already has enough lands on board. And remember, in the last video, I discussed the downside of increased variance inherent in introducing a second color to the deck. Many times, a Path to Exile will be stuck in our hand without access to white mana. So while Kosi's Trickster gives choices to our opponent and increases the variance of our mana base, Cursecatcher's ability limits our opponent's choices by threatening to tax or counter their spells. Remember, Merfolk is not merely an aggro deck, it's a tempo deck. The plan is not just to attack with a bunch of big dumb creatures, it's to attack while also reducing our opponent's efficiency, which Cursecatcher allows us to do quite well. Next up is Triton Shorestalker. It's rare for Merfolk to get any new playable creatures when new sets come out. For this reason, I and many other Merfolk pilots got a little excited when Triton Shorestalker was printed in Journey into Nyx in mid-2014. Perhaps a 1-cost 1/1 Merfolk creature who's naturally unblockable would be better than Cursecatcher for the deck, being able to attack past early blockers even without Island Walk. While I did win a couple of games because of these few extra points of damage, over the course of many weeks of testing, in many games, Shorestalker's unblockability was redundant because Island Walk was online. And in other games, Cursecatcher's ability would have been very helpful or could have outright won the game by countering a crucial spell. Again, as with Kosi's Trickster, Cursecatcher wins out against Triton Shorestalker because his ability fulfills the tempo plan of the Merfolk deck, slowing the opponent down while also dealing damage while Shorestalker just attacks. Last up is Moth Dust Changeling, certainly the funniest looking of the bunch. At first glance, the Changeling doesn't appear to stack up very well against Shorestalker. Whereas Shorestalker is naturally evasive, Moth Dust requires us to tap one of our creatures to gain flying. This ability can occasionally prove useful while blocking against aggressive decks with many flyers, such as Affinity, as shown in this example, where Monththost effectively trades for an attacking Vault Scourge with Cranial Plating equipped. However, the cost of tapping one of our creatures is generally way too high, especially only to facilitate a one-cost creature. If we go a bit deeper, we realize that Monththost Changeling is not just a Merfolk, but in fact, all creature types. This includes Elemental, and so the Changeling gets pumped by both Merfolk Lords and Master of Waves, making him a slightly more effective top deck in the mid and late game than any of the other one-cost Merfolk options. For this reason, combined with his flying ability, it's my belief that Monththost Changeling is the strongest alternative to Cursecatcher in Modern Merfolk, but still falls quite short of replacing him in the deck. As a final note on Cursecatcher, it's important to observe that he reduces the deck's need to run counterspells in the main deck. Cursecatcher's ability takes advantage of the uniquely blue part of the color pie, including counterspells, whereas all the other one-cost Merfolk mentioned here only block an attack. Every color has great one-cost creatures that can block an attack. One of the biggest benefits of playing Merfolk is having access to blue counter magic effects. Cursecatcher can attack, block, and counter spells. Having this kind of versatility and value in one card is a theme that we'll see repeated in all the other Merfolk creature cards we'll discuss next. Whereas Cursecatcher is often referred to as the worst card in the deck, Silvergill Adept is often referred to as the best card in the deck. While both claims are exaggerations, the one about Silvergill is much closer to the mark. It is truly an amazing creature card. A 2-power Merfolk for 1 generic and 1 blue mana is a fine rate, but drawing a card is an enormous bonus. As I mentioned in the Mulligan section, cards are the most valuable resource in the game of Magic. Really, they're the only resource. The text, "draw a card," is rare and precious, and should be valued extremely highly. And all Silvergill Adept requires of us, in exchange for this marvelous ability, is to reveal another Merfolk card from our hand. Quite a bargain. As mentioned in the second video, this additional cost is an excellent reason, on top of other tribal synergies, to pack the deck full of Merfolk and to strictly limit the number of non-Merfolk creatures. Without an extra Merfolk to reveal while casting Silvergill, we're required to pay 3 additional mana, and suddenly the card doesn't seem so efficient anymore. It's important to note that these are additional costs to cast Silvergill. Since AEther Vial does not cast spells, but rather puts creatures directly onto the battlefield, one does not have to reveal a Merfolk or pay 3 extra mana when putting Silvergill into play with AEther Vial. For this reason, tapping AEther Vial to flash Silvergill into play is often my first play during my main phase. This gives me an extra card to look at before deciding on my land drop for the turn, playing any spells, or attacking. This extra information is very valuable and allows for more efficient and effective play. Because its casting cost is flexible, only requiring 1 blue mana, and because it draws a card, Silvergill Adept can be a very good reason to keep a land-light opening hand. A hand with a single blue source, even without AEther Vial, can be a reasonable keep when we're on the draw, if it contains a Silvergill or 2, because the chances of drawing any land in our deck by our second turn are solid, and then the Silvergills can help dig for more land. While mulliganing, whether on the play or draw, a decent 1 blue source hand with Silvergill should be a keep because we have an additional scry to help us hit our lands. Apart from Cursecatcher, Merrow Reejerey and Harbinger of the Tides are the other tricky Merfolk in the deck, and they go together like peanut butter and jelly. Let's start by looking at Harbinger of the Tides. Harbinger of the Tides is the most recent creature addition to Modern Merfolk, printed in mid-2015 in the Magic Origin set. When Harbinger was first previewed, players immediately knew he would make a big splash in the deck, and he has gone on to exceed expectations. Initially lauded as an instant speed way to interact with the Splinter Twin combo, players soon realized Harbinger's more general value in the creature-dominated Modern format. It wasn't long ago that many, if not most, Modern Merfolk lists ran multiple Vapor Snags in the main deck. Harbinger's Unsummon ability has allowed the deck to cut back on instants such as Vapor Snag while increasing Merfolk density, a great step forward for the deck. Whether played at sorcery speed or at instant speed with AEther Vial or with Flash, Harbinger typically sets our opponent back a great deal when he bounces one of their creatures. As with Cursecatcher, Harbinger can be a poster boy for the tempo strategy, attacking while simultaneously hampering the opponent's plans. Harbinger's bounce ability does have a restriction, however. It requires the opposing creature to be tapped. What would you say if I told you we have a Merfolk who can tap these opposing creatures for Harbinger? Or tap or untap any permanent on the battlefield as we find necessary? Well, we do, and his name is Merrow Reejerey. Merrow Reejerey, at 3 mana, is our most expensive Merfolk Lord. However, only having 1 blue mana in his casting cost often makes him easier to cast than our Island Walking Lords. And, as we often want to tick AEther Vial up to 4 to get Master of Waves into play, having some creatures that cost 3 mana, such as Merrow Reejerey, actually makes AEther Vial more effective by giving us something to put into play when Vial has 3 counters. Having creatures at this mana cost also smooths our mana curve, increasing the efficiency of our games, even without AEther Vial, by giving the deck strong plays on every early turn of the game. While our Island Walk Lords are generally considered the most powerful because they can make all other Merfolk unblockable, Merrow Reejerey's ability makes him an extremely potent Swiss Army knife in the deck. He can ramp our mana by untapping lands. He can tap down opposing creatures to improve our attacks or to facilitate Harbinger of the Tide's ability. He can untap a Merfolk after combat to leave up a blocker. He can untap AEther Vial for explosive turns, combined with Combined with Harbinger of the Tides at instant speed, he can tap down an opponent's land during their upkeep. The possibilities are really endless. And it gets even crazier with multiple Reejereys on the battlefield. Note that Reejerey requires us to actually cast a Merfolk. In order for him to trigger a creature entering the battlefield through AEther Vial will not... Note that Reejerey requires us to actually cast a Merfolk in order for him to trigger. A creature entering the battlefield through AEther Vial will not trigger his ability. Giving all the deck's Merfolk +1/+1 on top of all his versatility makes including 4 copies of Reejerey in the deck a very easy decision. Next up is the Big Kahuna, the Head Honcho, the Master of the House. Master of Waves is the single most powerful card in Modern Merfolk. In situations where we have no creatures on the battlefield, Master of Waves is our best top deck, instantly populating the board with 4 power or potentially more if we've played Spreading Seas earlier in the game, while also pumping any Mutavaults we happen to have out. Most opponents don't realize that Mutavault is also an elemental creature, so this can sometimes be a sneaky path to victory. Like Harbinger of the Tides, Master of Waves is a relatively new inclusion in the deck. Printed in Theros in late 2013, this Merfolk bomb was actually hotly contested at first. Many Merfolk pilots vehemently claimed that this was quote-unquote not what Merfolk wants to be doing. Playing a 4-cost creature was a big break in tradition for a deck accustomed to literally never ticking AEther Vial above 2. Here are some quotes from a Reddit discussion shortly after Master of Waves was printed. From Colwyn, "I've been playing Fish for a while now, and I don't think this is where we want to be. I don't think this guy could ever be better than, say, another Lord. He costs 4, which is a lot for a 20-land deck with no draw power, and he doesn't really help you kill them the turn he comes in. For example, casting 2 Lords on turn 4 in the situation you just described would have the opponent extra dead." From Sakatsu Deacon, "Master of Waves isn't exactly what we want. On turn 4, I'd rather play another Lord or 2, and Vial in another Lord." From Habadu, "He costs 4. He is unplayable." And from the Kaldar, "This card looks really bad to me. It's only a 2/1, which at 4 mana is really bad. It has protection from Lightning Bolt, but it still dies to all creature combat and Path to Exile. Even if you pump out a bunch of guys, if you kill the Master of Waves, you lose all your guys." All of these ridiculous comments had positive ratings, suggesting that the general consensus at the time was that Master of Waves is terrible. But the Master has since more than proved himself in competitive play, appearing in virtually every winning Modern Merfolk deck since its printing. On top of the raw power of his token-making ability, Master of Waves' protection from red has been a very welcome addition to the deck, giving it longevity against popular red removal spells, including Lightning Bolt, Lightning Helix, Electrolyze, Terminate, Kolaghan's Command, Forked Bolt, Flame Slash, Galvanic Blast, Roast, Rending Volley, Searing Blaze, Dreadbore, red damage-based board wipes such as Anger of the Gods, Pyroclasm, Fire Spout, and Volcanic Fallout, and red planeswalkers such as Ajani Vengeant and Nahiri the Harbinger. Master of Waves also blocks Goblin Guide and Monastery Swiftspear all day. Additionally, Master of Waves also happens to be immune to one of the most popular non-red pieces of removal in the format, Abrupt Decay. The only non-Merfolk in the entire deck, Kira, Great Glass Spinner, certainly has a lot to prove to make the cut. Unable to be buffed by any lords, unable to trigger Merrow Reejerey, and unable to be revealed while casting Silvergill Adept, Kira seems at first like a square peg in a round hole. Upon inspection, however, her stats and abilities speak for themselves. At 3 mana, Kira joins Merrow Reejerey at that point in the mana curve to increase the productivity of our lands and AEther Vial. Her casting cost includes 2 blue mana symbols, which can occasionally be difficult to pay, but once on the battlefield, she provides 2 extra devotion for Master of Waves. As a 2/2 flyer, she can block against Affinities flyers, and she can even push damage in the air, even when combat on the ground is stalled out. Above all, Kira is a stone wall, protecting all our Merfolk from targeted removal. If an opponent wants to remove Kira or any Merfolk, they have to spend 2 cards to do so, giving us card advantage. As with Cursecatcher and Harbinger of the Tides, Kira furthers our tempo plan by attacking while slowing our opponents down. While some successful lists have run 2 Kiras in the main deck, I disagree with it. Not only is Kira not a Merfolk, and so suffers from a lack of synergy, but she is also a legendary creature. Drawing a second Kira while having another in hand or in play is pretty close to a dead draw, which is something we want to avoid at all costs. Remember, low variance is a good thing. One last thing to be aware of is that Kira's ability will counter Reejerey's ability if we try to target one of our own creatures while she's on the battlefield. Every Merfolk in the deck is included at the full 4 copies because they each perform a vital role in the deck's strategy. At this quantity, they form an effective mana curve that ensures the deck has explosive starts and stable and powerful endgames. Kira is included as a singleton non-Merfolk in order to provide strong protection for our game plan, and for all her other secondary benefits previously mentioned. Including Kira as a singleton eliminates the possibility of drawing her twice. We either draw her and she does her job, or we don't and we simply draw Merfolk. There's no chance of drawing a second Kira and potentially wasting a vital draw step. The decision to include each Merfolk as a full playset, as well as Kira as a singleton, is guided by the central principle of reducing variance, lowering the effect of randomness in the deck over many games while increasing the importance of skillful play. This concludes the 4th video, where we've looked at the deck's creatures. Please join me for the next video, which will focus on the deck's non-creature spells. As always, please leave any comments or questions you might have, and please subscribe if you enjoy my videos. Thank you.